This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and senior economist with the International Grain Program, Guy Allen, as they discuss domestic and international grain markets with the recent release of the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates from the USDA. Dan O'Brien and Guy Allen continue the show and conversation about the recent WASDE report. Guy also covers the U.S. dollar index and international freight market. Finishing this week's shows is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with a weather update. This past week, parts of Kansas got substantial rain. However, certain parts got hail with their precipitation. That and more's coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. However, he is also going to be joined by senior economist with the International Grains Program, Guy Allen, as the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates came out recently on July 12th, and they're going to have a conversation about that. Dan, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Kind of getting started with our usual here today, Dan. What are futures looking like?
Well, volatile. The day of the report on Wednesday, the 12th, we had a sharp drop-off in corn, soybean, and impact also on wheat futures. We'll talk about wheat later, but we did see a recovery yesterday of at least part of that drop with September corn closing at 493 DEES at that kind of its benchmark anymore, $5, basically $5.50, and being up about 16 cents. So a lot of volatility, and that generally that sharp downward response was to the USDA's numbers that showed basically ending stocks still being above 2 billion bushels, an estimate of about 2.26 billion, about 2.3. Stocks to use 16%. So the market interpreted those numbers as very, very bearish, and then dropped off, recovered some. For soybeans, you've got a situation we'll talk about why it had done that, but we saw the kind of the opposite, where more of an optimistic view of where the markets could go. We saw for soybean futures, we had a lot of volatility at about 1440 thereabouts, closed actually up on the August contract up 40 cents up to 1484 3/4. We're in these lofty price areas, aren't even worried about this. It doesn't surprise us anymore. This is where we quote spend our time anymore in the markets. So just a great amount of volatility. You see in the information that we put out on AgManager and on your website, volatility indices for both corn and soybeans, and strong upward moves for both of them. Really, it's kind of a question now as we sit on this precipice of mid-July where we go from here, and we'll talk about that later.
I mentioned that the WASDE report recently came out, and we're kind of going to weave that into our conversation as we talk about our domestic grain market also. And so starting with the commodity of corn, what do we see and how did that report impact it?
Well, this report took the acreage numbers from that end of June acreage report, plugged in the corn number of 94.096 million acres planted, up from 92 million. And you did see the USDA drop their estimate of the corn yield from 181.5, trend line yield from early on this year down to 177.5, and basically ended up at just about the same place, at just about 15.3 billion bushels. Really no other changes on the usage side for the supply-demand balance sheet to speak of. Ending stocks still about the same place, about 2.57, 2.62 billion bushels. The price did not change, etc. I would say while we're talking corn, a grain sorghum is just a close cousin, still a feed grain, pretty important for us out here in the Western Plains. And you did see also a jump up in the grain sorghum acreage from 5.97 before that report up to about 6.8. Production from 360 million projected now up to 411, and ending stocks at about just up a little bit. What's kind of working behind the scenes that's surprising to me is really pretty strong forward purchases for grain sorghum. Surprisingly so, Guy, on that crop. We pay a lot of attention to corn, and generally we're just so in terms of our pace there, but the grain sorghum numbers, you've got forward sales of 104% of the USDA's projection. And I would say, just to add in on the international side, not much change really in ending stocks. A projection for ending stocks to jump higher at the end of 23-24. It starts September 1st. Guy, any international comments you'd have on the corn market?
No, just reflecting back on futures, we're back for December corn's the lowest level since November of 2021, which is, I just don't understand why we're dropping to such low levels, as you said, giving the tightness both domestically here in the U.S. and globally. The international news that we're seeing has been quite bearish in a lot of ways, particularly with the big crops coming out of Brazil and that second corn crop and the slowness in the export pace. But it's just things are very, very tight underlying both domestically and internationally. And it's not going to take much of a change of the wind to, I think, rally these prices back from these current low levels on that.
I remember earlier on this year that when the second corn crop, the safrinha corn crop, was planted in Brazil, that it was planted about a month late. And you look at the weather maps down there, and they're dry in those areas. So, but we have enough enthusiasm and enough projections that everything will be fine. That we haven't heard that, but I guess I haven't heard of any impact of that. But I would still be watchful in coming weeks as to the possibility of dry weather catching some of that crop and trimming it down some late. But it's just my own thought.
Yeah, well, just today, CONAB came out with a Brazilian crop estimate for corn of 127 million tons, including their three crop harvests. That exceeds the total grown last year by 14.6 million metric tons. That's nearly a 13% increase in crop. And it's been moving to market as rapidly as they can get it moved that way. So that's really weighing on that market.
Those are the numbers the market's bidding off of at this time.
And as we've talked about corn now, Dan, you mentioned sorghum. So what are we seeing there?
A big thing on sorghum is, again, that acreage increase. And sorghum right now, that the part of the country we grow that in has a lot of moisture. And unless we get too cool of weather, there's some issue that slows that crop down. And it got into the fall, it seems like we're poised to have a lot of sorghum bushels come into play. And exports, et cetera, seem to be holding up surprisingly well at this time. So interesting to watch and see where all that goes.
Guy, have you seen anything on the international side for grain sorghum?
Nothing new on the sorghum market. The sorghum and the corn markets have been internationally been fairly quiet, with not necessarily a lot of new news happening there. We do continue to keep one eye on the Ukraine, but we'll talk about that when we get to wheat. And the Chinese demand's been steady, but nothing exciting there on the sorghum side of things. And it's that Chinese demand, which in the past few years has either put a big premium in that sorghum relative to corn, or when it sort of fades away, sorghum settles down to corn price or just under.
We've talked about corn now. We've talked about grain sorghum. And one more commodity we want to talk about on our first segment here of Agriculture Today is soybeans.
Yes, the driver on soybeans is, I guess we're pivoting off of that acreage report where the USDA dropped the planted acreage in the United States by 4 million acres from 87.5 down to 83.505. And the USDA kept the same yield of 52 million acres, but the net of that's that we dropped from about 4.5 billion bushels down to 4.3, saw the reverberations coming through the supply-demand balance sheet. The USDA did, I guess in response to what they see as needed rationing that'll happen with just less supplies, the crush number was down a little bit, about 10 million down to 2.3 billion. The export number, given the anticipation of all that's coming out of Brazil in particular, down 125 million bushels. Ending stocks at the end of all that, down 50 million, down to 300 million bushels. The USDA did give a feint towards anticipation of stronger markets, raised the season average price projection from $12.10 a bushel up to $12.40. Guy, any comments that you have on the international aspects of the soybean market, especially with what you anticipate coming out of China and other customers?
Looking at the supply side first, USDA put Brazil for 22-23 at 156 million metric tons. For this coming year, it's at a new record of 163 million metric tons. Looking at Argentina for this past year, they had that at 25 million metric tons, but they're increasing that on more optimistic weather up to 48 million metric tons. So that's going to be fairly significant increase in that South American production on that. Looking at the demand side, they really didn't change China too much. Imports were just up slightly, only 350,000 tons. China was up 1 million to 99. I actually think that's a bit optimistic, but that would put them back up to more levels that we've seen the last few years. Other imports have been reduced by 3.25 million metric tons to 166, mostly across Southeast Asia. I think that's a reflection of sort of the higher prices that we've seen and just some decline in demand. Also, the big unknown on that is the impact of African swine fever, which continues to raise its head up fairly frequently. China specifically, its crush is expected to be fairly steady at 95 million metric tons for 23-24 going forward. That's up 4 million metric tons from the 91 million metric tons they have plugged in for 22-23. So no real surprises on that, but it does tend to be a bit supportive from China's situation. But as we've seen, China seems to have a real preference for buying from Brazil rather than the U.S. at the moment. And look, that's a pricing situation.
As we move away from La Nina into El Nino, generally, if I understand those weather patterns, what we anticipate to be dry moves north in South America. So the Argentina, southern Brazil, the dry conditions this year, as we get the full-blown impact of La Nina, I think we'd see areas like Mato Grosso. Some of those areas, stronger areas to the north, would be at more risk for dryness. So what we anticipate for next year for South America has yet to be planted. That'll be planted October, November, December. So it's all betting on the come, I guess.
Yeah, and I'd suggest I don't think the USDA has adjusted those numbers for an El Nino, La Nina weather situation. I think they tend to use a trend line number there, and I think that 163 million is pretty optimistic.
A lot of this information from a recent USDA report, the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we're going to be joined once again by Guy Allen and Dan O'Brien, and we're going to continue this conversation and talk a little bit about wheat, but also the dollar index and some international freight market information. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our conversation about the WASDE report with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and senior economist with the International Grain Program, Guy Allen. Dan, getting started with you in our recent segment, which if you missed, you can listen to on agtoday.net. We talked about corn, grain sorghum, and soybeans, and so starting the conversation now about wheat.
The report that just came out, that WASDE report, released July the 12th, did show an increase in U.S. ending stocks and U.S. production, up about 74 million to 1.739 billion bushels, and ending stocks up to 592 from about 562. And the surprise in that report came from higher hard red winter wheat and soft red winter wheat numbers domestically in the U.S. and had been expected. And really, the late rains that have come are being factored into those numbers. Really some lower numbers for U.S. durum wheat grown to the northern states. Hard red spring also lower. I think the bigger picture, step over into just a little bit internationally, at least on our continent, just extremely dry conditions, horribly dry conditions up in Canada, impacting how much wheat and other crops are anticipating coming out of there. So that's in play. The USDA did drop the domestic price projection about 20 cents down to 7.50. And just in terms of class by class changes, maybe the best thing to look at is anticipated changes in ending stocks. Hard red winter down about 5 million bushels. Hard red spring down about 3, so not a lot of change. But soft red winter numbers, ending stocks up about 45. So there you have it, Guy. It's the soft red winter in the Illinois, et cetera. That's in that Illinois, Indiana. It's kind of leading the day. White wheat also projected to be down about 9, et cetera. So much is riding on the major run up in soft red winter that it has affected the overall U.S. supply-demand balance sheet.
Yeah, just being back in Illinois over the 4th of July, the wheat harvest was coming off, and they were coming off quite better than anticipated. Not a lot of wheat through that area, but what was coming off did look quite good. Yeah, just turning to the international situation, USDA put world wheat production at about 796.7 million metric tons. Now, that was down 3.5 million metric tons from about 800 million metric tons last month, but it's still a record world wheat production that we're looking at. And even though it's looking pretty tough here in the the Western Plains and up into Canada. The rest of the world's actually experiencing a fairly good wheat crop. Ukrainian forecast was at 17.5, unchanged. Exports at 10.5. Russian production was at 85 million metric tons, unchanged from June, but down 8% from last year. Exports are still projected at about 47 to 48 million metric tons. That was up a million metric tons from last month, and again, the highest export number coming out of Russia. The EU, though, it was off about 1.5 million metric tons compared to last June at 138.5 million metric tons, but they did leave exports unchanged on that. And Canada, as you said, that dry weather up there is having an impact. It came down 2 million metric tons to about 35 million metric tons of export compared to 33.8 last year. Now, going down to my favorite place, Australia, those numbers were left unchanged, but they are down from last year. Production's coming in at 29 million metric tons compared to just under 40 last year. But exports are expected to be up 500,000 metric tons. So we will continue to see that. As you mentioned, El Nino situation, that tends to be dry weather for Australia, but they've continued to have very good rains, particularly in the eastern belt over there. Interesting enough, on the bigger producers, India's forecast is at 13.5 million metric tons, which is unchanged from June. But interestingly, it looks like India is going to shut off any exports coming out of there, particularly for any domestically produced wheat. I was reading today in the wires. China was left unchanged at 140 million metric tons. But as you and I have discussed, we've had some wet weather over there in China, which has downgraded some of the wheat. They're expected to import 12 million metric tons of milling grade type wheat. Some of the domestic stuff will be fed, and they expect that feed number to be up to about 36 million metric tons of poor quality wheat that needs to be fed. That's going to take world ending stocks down to 22.6 million metric tons. That's down 4.2 from last month and below the 269 from last year. That's taking the global stocks to use ratio down to 33 1/3 compared to 34 last month, and it was about 34 for last year as well. So we continue to tighten that wheat situation up. And look, I think all wheat needs to do, for the most part, is stay priced out of the feed ration in those areas where it needs to, particularly in the U.S. I still think corn's going to be the leader, and that's why, even though the wheat numbers I'd suggest were fairly bullish, with those corn numbers coming down, wheat just needs to stay a bit of a premium to that.
You know, we talk about mega trends, and Guy, I know you have strong opinions on this. When you look at that world stocks use number of 33.3%, that's the lowest since 2015-16, and the 20% world minus China ending stocks number is as tight as I have going back at least to 2013-14. So from being a longtime world wheat observer and a former buyer-seller on that and on the futures, how do you navigate a market with such potential volatility like that?
Well, very carefully. One, just stay hedged up, and I've never been accused of being a flat price cowboy. So just managing that risk is becoming increasingly important. Might turn to one area that's been quite volatile this week is this U.S. dollar value. We've seen a significant drop of that just in the last few days and in the last week. It's dropped from about 102 down to below 100 into the 99 range. This is the lowest level we've seen in this dollar index for about 14 and a half months, which doesn't surprise me. It's in the wake of weaker than expected U.S. exports, and not only in agriculture, but in other products there as well. And then continued Federal Reserve rate hikes. You know, the economic situation, although it's moving towards improvement, it's still not a real pretty outlook. And I think that's starting to devalue the dollar. I can't help but think, some of the efforts by China and Russia to remove the U.S. dollar as the world currency is starting to have some impact there as well. And I found it interesting that the UN came out today. People are suggesting that they're going to let Russia return to using the SWIFT system to do their banking in that. And I can't help but wonder if that's maybe being driven by this downward move in the U.S. dollar there as well. Said though, a lot of our major buyers of wheat or potential buyers of wheat still haven't necessarily gained an appreciation in the value of their currency against the U.S. dollar. We need to keep in mind the big drivers of that index is the EU and Japan, and they're not necessarily big buyers of U.S. wheat.
And something else important to the grain market is the international freight market.
Yes, we always need to keep an eye on that. International freight rates have come down a bit since May. Not a lot. They've moved from about 1,500, I think, down to about 1,100 on the index. But that I'd suggest, is another leading indicator of just a lack of international import demand from our customers on that. And the thing I've always found, Dan and I talk a lot about production, and production is usually pretty well quantified. And the part of the market that will sneak up on you is that drop in demand. It's just a lot harder to quantify and see coming down the road.
And as we've talked about this WASDE report, were there any big surprises or anything that kind of shocked you for how it impacted the domestic market here in the U.S. or how it impacted the world market?
Corn was the big surprise. Look, we're down to lows we haven't seen since 2021. Given the tightness of the global situation, I just don't think that these sort of price levels are justified, particularly in the continuing inflationary environment on that. And look, if I was a buyer, I'd sure be fronting up to the table to putting some price coverage on. But we haven't seen that demand come to the market, and that just worries me a bit.
My surprise on that, Shelby, is that yes, we have short-term rains. So when I look at drought monitor maps, projected soil moisture in pretty important parts of the U.S. Corn Belt, still showing pretty dry. So I think we're sort of riding the wave of rains that come through, et cetera, and then really until we get closer to the end, I think we're still going to have a lot of uncertainty as to where the markets are, where the production is for corn, for soybeans, and where we finally end up. But moisture sure helps without question. But is it a 15.3 billion bushel corn crop or a 4.3 billion bushel soybean crop, or is it something different? I think we're still up for a fair ride on this all the way through the August and really, more importantly, probably the September crop report. And we'll just have to see. Guy, any thoughts on that?
No, I really don't have anything to add. We're running pretty close to the edge, and it seems like the market has actually got close, particularly on corn and soybeans, at this tightness of not only U.S. but global stocks, and that's in the wake of record production as well as record demand. And it's just it doesn't take much to change things pretty quick.
Dan, Guy, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and talk about the international and domestic grain market.
Thank you, Shelby. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was senior economist with the International Grains Program, Guy Allen, and K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. A link to the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report can be found in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update. And as always, we're joined with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Chip, starting off our conversation with what we've seen this past week, and South Central Kansas has gotten some good news.
Yeah, they're the big winners this week. They got a lot of rain from multiple different events over the last 7 days. And the drought monitor that ended at 7 a.m. on Tuesday morning reflected that precipitation. We saw the rare 2 drought category improvement for several areas in the South Central, mostly around that Kingman into Harper and westward into Barber County. They got a lot of rain. They got it over a longer period of time, so it wasn't all a heavy rain. So all of it soaked in the ground for the most part. And overall, a good positive swing in things and some positivity following what's been a pretty prolonged drought for that area. It's not the end-all, be-all. They're still in moderate drought, so they have a long ways to go yet, but definitely started making a big difference, especially in that region. Elsewhere across the state, we still have precipitation for most of the region. The north central is kind of that one void that keeps missing it. And to the northeast, we didn't see much moisture over the last 7 days. but parts of southeast also saw precipitation in western Kansas as well. So we're getting some moisture, which is better than none at all. We're way better off than we were this time last year when we were seeing rapidly degrading drought conditions, and definitely a positive turn.
And we also saw some severe weather in Kansas.
Yeah, unfortunately, we did see some severe weather, especially in the northwest, that Wallace to Sherman County region. There was a storm that tracked basically from northeast Colorado down, and we're talking 5, 10, you might even, in some places, 15-mile wide swath of hail that just wiped out everything. It wasn't huge hail, so we weren't getting like baseballs and softballs, but lots of half-inch hail that's sub-severe. It was being blown by 40, 50 mile an hour, which is also sub-severe. But when you get so much of it, it just beats those fields down to nothing. And basically every crop in that region, there was some good-looking wheat out there. Unfortunately, a lot of it got beat down into the ground by the white combine. And that's the risk we face. We're going to get precipitation in the summer months. It's likely going to have severe weather with it.
And can we expect to see some more severe weather as we move forward?
Yeah, we still keep we have precipitation chances through the weekend and into early next week. And with that will be the severe weather risk, albeit we don't expect like widespread hail damage like that or anything. Those will hopefully be isolated in nature. But the risk is there, especially for winds this time of year with really warmer temperatures and those cool downdrafts. You get big temperature contrast. We get stronger wind gusts.
However, overall, while we might see a little bit of severe weather, overall precipitation not looking to be extreme.
Yeah, we're starting to see things slow down a little bit with the pattern. It's starting to, we have high pressure that's gradually starting to build in again to our south and west, and that's going to result in a little bit less precipitation chances. We're still going to have chances of storms. We'll still see episodes of thunderstorms. They're just going to be a little bit more localized, not as widespread, not as organized. And really we're getting into the summer months where we typically see our average precipitation start to tail off. And we're past our peak precipitation and highest moisture amounts on a weekly basis. And now they're starting to fall off. And with that, we'd expect less precipitation in general.
With the summer months, severe weather, but also the heat.
Yeah, so we've got another area of pretty significant heat building to our south and west that we'll have to keep an eye on. There is some monsoon moisture that's going to hopefully get drawn up into it, which will moderate it some. But we had a little taste of heat early this week before the cold front, or I guess the outflow boundary from the thunderstorms, kind of blew all the forecasts in central and eastern Kansas. But heat's building to our south and west, and that's something to keep an eye on as we move further into July. And as that system might potentially strengthen and move a little bit further east later towards August, we could potentially be seeing some above normal temperatures for an extended period of time.
Chip, I appreciate you coming on and giving us a weather update once again.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was Kansas State University meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with you on Monday.